do this. And another discussion which has been going on endlessly in my head is, you know, in normal neoclassical macro, you tend to argue that the GDP is the sum of investment and consumption and government. So if you want that formulation, you should take government spending should go directly to the GDP, and the investment here should go directly to the GDP, and then this output from the private sector should go up there. So that's another way of formulating it. The reason why we've ended up not doing it this way here is that we get an additional problem when we need to know how big part of the economy is actually green. Because if you then say that you want to distinguish between the amount of public activity which is green and the amount of private that is green, you know, then you need the two. But then I, as a wise person, you start thinking, how in the world am I going to measure, you know, in how big fraction of the economy is green? And if I then in addition need numbers for how much of the private sector is green compared to how much of the public sector, I start seeing that here comes a measurement problem, which is unsolvable. And one way of solving this is, of course, then to blend the two, because it's at least a little easier to speak about total Germany and say, is it 1% of the economy which is green, or is it 10%? You know, and whether, and also you then duck issues like, you know, so the windmills owned by the government, or the windmills owned by, are they owned by the government, or are they owned by the guys that have gotten the subsidies and then borrowed the money? Don't worry if you don't follow this discussion. It's just to make the simple point that there is no truth. And how you formulate your model is in order to make it maximally useful for the questions that you're interested in analyzing. Yes, please.
How do you then decide when you calculate a fraction of capacity which is green? What things which, let's say, are at the gray area, for example, streets. Streets where electrical cars drive, you can say, okay, that's green, as long as fossil cars are going on the streets, you can say that's non-green.
So why don't I? No, I'll be brutal, as I am normally, because I think you will learn a lot from this. It surprises me that you, who are such a schooled, and tell me loud and clear, how do the national accounts distinguish between consumption and investment?
Not sure.
Okay, fine. So everyone who knows macroeconomics and all neoclassical people, you know, speak about consumption and investment as the most normal thing, and they use statistical summaries of these numbers with the greatest self-sufficiency. So where do the numbers come from? You know, so this, you know, I had thought you would then say, oh, sorry, so yes.
I just assume now, I remember something from somewhere that it might be not distinguished in some cases, and some it will be just in the calculations in different categories of like the GDP factors and stuff, but I'm not sure.
So you are at least in the right direction, because initially you would think that you have industries, you know, that road building industry, investment. Shipbuilding industry, you would say, is investment. Then you would take, so BASF in this country, making chemicals. So what is chemicals? Is that investment or is that consumption? You know, so then you start developing what exists, the rules. And of course, it immediately gets very complicated because then you have a plumbing, just a plumber, you know, the guy that fixes the tubes. Fine, if he only fixes the tubes, then clearly this is consumption. But if he then starts producing pumps, you know, in the back office, you know, that clearly is investment. You know, the pump is then established somewhere as an investment. So the amazing answer to my question is that this is done. This is what the statistical offices do. They look at each of these things and they say this is 3% investment and 97% consumption. This is this, that, and the other. So the whole basis of the capitalist system as reflected in national accounts is based on, you know, and because of course, because of the guys who sit in that poor office, you know, what do they have access to? They have access to the annual accounts of the company, and the annual account of the company does not distinguish between income earned from, you know, putting tubes in place and income earned from selling pumps. So the whole foundation, for those people who give numbers with 7 significant digits, the ones that I hate, you know, they are totally unaware of the totally subjective basis for all of this. And so when you know, I've been unkind against you as much as I can, you know, so when you ask the question, how will you know how much is part of the green sector? You know, and that's the answer. So the point is that these are among the variables where Ulrich and I can choose any value that we think is of the order of correct. No one is ever going to be able to prove us wrong.
You just apply the constants.
So this is the point. So we choose a number. Then what is most important up here is what happens to the fraction. So what is the important strength here is if the concentration in the atmosphere reaches 500 parts per million, you know, how big fraction of the economy will at that point in time be dedicated to green solutions, meaning windmills and solar panels and things like this. And there you can at least start looking at history. We know that when warming reached 0.4%, 0 was in the green sector. We know that after the introduction of the subsidy in Germany in the year 2000, you know, sun and wind finally took off, so that in some countries, you know, that 0 started to be 0.1, and some countries, China, it got into perhaps 0.8. You know, so we have some indication of the order of magnitude. At this point in time, it is fully possible to look at Germany and say what is the GDP, what is the sales value of fossil cars? What is the sales value of electric cars? And then you must distinguish between the consumption or purchase of those things, the demand side, and the supply side. How much of those cars are produced here and how much of those cars are produced. So yes, it is possible, but you start seeing that the statistical problems that worry many people when they look at us, you know, they should worry much more about their own work, because they are then doing fine-tuning, they're calculating with 5 significant digits whether the GDP will be higher if you put in a subsidy on electric cars of 13% of the sales value as opposed to 11%. What they're doing is total bullshit. You know, has absolutely no scientific value, but it has huge political value, because this is the only thing the decision maker can lean on. And so this is a charade. It's a theater being played. And what we are trying to do is to capture the total effect of the charade in a model like this. Sorry for spending so much time on this point, but it's among the fundamental things that interests Mr. Schuster. This is one of 20, that are really at the core of the negative aspects of the neoclassical way of running world economies. Yes?
I just wanted to ask if I got you right. So you do not trust into the system of national accounts by the United Nations. It's a very, very sophisticated system. We have some similar thing in the
Yes.
European Union.
Yes.
There are strictly rules,
Yes.
and you don't trust in that.
So
what is investment consumption?
Exactly. So there are very clear protocols on how to do this, and the people who try to do this does it very well. But even I, as an idiot, and you as another idiot, understands if you know any single corporation from the inside, to try to decide what the output is, whether it is investment. So when you pay your taxes, the tax man does another thing. He says that anything that lasts for less than 3 years, you expend at once. You don't view it as investment, you use it as consumption. But that's a 3-year rule that he has invented in order to make tax collection a little less complicated than it otherwise would have been. So I'm not distrusting it in any way other than I'm saying that if you changed the protocol a little bit, you would get very, very different numbers. And it doesn't matter at all in my case. It matters a lot in the optimizing world, because if you then change the composition of the economy from being 67% consumption and 33% investment to 69 of the other and 31 in an optimizing model, it changes the GDP forecast dramatically. We are luckily not in the business of GDP forecasting. But it's really fascinating. What was your first question? Because it was... Yeah, but you said something that made me think about some other thing Ulrika and I have done, which is on this score about national accounting. Shit. Okay, I forgot. This is fertile ground. This is unbelievably interesting. And this is, again, the type of thing that those people that want to reform GDP or reduce GDP or the degrowth movement, this is what they should be interested in. Here are the, the subjective basis of the current Western empire. So where were we? So I've been through the population growth loop. I've been through the economy growth loop. This growth loop is parameterized in our model in such a way that it matches the observed growth rate of the world economy from 1980 to 2020. We know that the world economy grew by roughly 3.5% a year during those 40 years, with some variation in the growth rate, which leads me to the next point, namely the swings that you have seen on all the graphs. They're not smooth, they have business cycles on them. But that's how we then do a full systems estimation of the strength of the growth rate in the economy. We look at the real economy, and that's the number that comes out of the UN and the EU accounts. Now I remember why I sat down, because here's yet another story which I think is helpful for those of you who think there is a truth. Ulrich was given by me the job of, can you please improve the agriculture sector? Because people tell me that my data does not match the FAO's data. And consequently, since FAO is much more important than Jørgen, FAO must be correct. So Ulrich then asked, where did you get your data from? And I said, well, I have read this one paper, and then I remember I met this man who said such, and then I remember I invested in a forest company in Tanzania a long, long time ago, and things like this. And that's how I cook up these numbers. And then I've seen this paper where this man is trying to measure the amount of rainforest in the world and how fast has it changed. And then it struck me that my dear friend Claude Martin in WWF, he actually wrote after we quit in the middle 2005 a whole book about how fast Amazonas is disappearing and how fast the Congo is disappearing and how fast, and what is happening with the $1 billion that Norway is paying to Brazil in order to stop, etc. Very interesting, and all of this was the reason why I had parameterized the model the way it was parameterized. And then Ulrich got the job of doing this in a manner which was acceptable to our friends in Berlin. So we cooperated with the Potsdam Institute, which consists of a lot of German scientists. And these German scientists, they don't believe in average numbers with one digit. These ones things with 6 or 7, and they don't listen to me when I say this is bullshit. So he was given the task. And Ulrich, poor Ulrich, endlessly patient and endlessly detailed, he finally proved that the FAO statistics are totally inconsistent. If you look at the growth rates, the estimated growth rates of the forests during the year, and you look at the stock of trees at the beginning, then you add the growth during the year, and then you look at the stock at the end. Stock and flow inconsistent. The world's best statistics on food and agriculture are internally inconsistent because they don't do the stock and flow check, because they can't, because these are exceedingly rough estimates, both of the standing wood, etc. We went back to the German scientists in Berlin and said that, this source of data can't be used because it is internally inconsistent. We can't use this in our model because our model has to be stock and flow consistent. So what happened with Hannes and the guys, Ulrich, in the end? Or what they do, you came up with a set of data and say, basically, this is how it has to be. This is not the way it is being measured, and that's what we use. Isn't that roughly true? Yeah. He's German, of course, so he's a little bit more precise than I am, but but it's scary when you run into these things, and it's even more scary when you look at the energy statistics and the CO2 emission statistics, because of course the national governments lie as much as they can, particularly in corrupt countries, and in the FAO, the important parameter there is what is a forest, as a composed compared to savanna. Savanna is grass with one tree, and then you walk for half a kilometer, then there's another tree. And so the canopy density, is the one important number, just like the investment fraction for the economy. And so what national governments do in order to get help is that they just instruct the National Office of Accounting to just adjust the canopy factor a little bit. And then, the forest area moves up and down very happily. Norway does things like this. The other year, no. Fine. The main point for you who get dug down in the detail, the main point is that you should not trust me, but you should not trust everyone else. Fine. The only advantage we have on everything else, we are consistent. The different parts of our picture match. We cannot do a fake here, without that having, it moves through all of the arrows. And so if we change something here, it will change something here. And if the change here improves the precision, while the consequent change up here reduces the match to reality, you know, we have to judge, you know, whether we do the one or the other. While the forestry ministry in Tanzania, they don't need to match. So they just, you know, adjust according to will. And this is very much like what the corporations do when they report their profits. So of course, there is endless flexibility in the accounting rules at the corporate level, which also makes it possible for you to get exactly the return that you would like to have, and particularly to report it where you would like to report it. So again, the main point, don't trust the world. This is of course not very helpful because we need trust.